think it's time to come back to this session. This session will be more focused on formulation of product good for health and with pleasure. And this session will be chaired by Camille Michon. Camille Michon is a professor at AgroParisTech in Paris and director of unit on food processing and engineering. Camille.
Thank you very much. So it's my pleasure to open this second session. Now we still speak about sensory and nutrition, but we will focus on the way to produce, to formulate foods in order to have good sensory and nutritional foods. So I welcome Markus Stieger, who will be the first speaker, and he comes from the University of Wageningen. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me the possibility to speak here. I really appreciate it. It's always nice to come to Dijon in Burgundy. It's always a joy. I always wonder how much sense it makes actually to talk in France about the reformulation of foods. I remember when we started a European project that is here coordinated by INRA, there were also some discussions from the French parties involved. Should we reformulate our foods or not? So despite that, I will talk about reformulation of foods. Well, as you all know and has been outlined this morning, healthy eating is essential to prevent diseases and also to promote health. The demand for healthy food seems to increase by the consumers. So what's the challenge that the food industry facing is in the end to change the composition of the foods in order to make them healthier while keeping the sensory properties the same, while keeping acceptance by the consumers unchanged, while keeping costs unchanged or issues related to sustainable production of foods. I will focus today very much on the sensory quality and won't talk about costs and other issues related to the production of foods. So what does it mean if you start taking salt or sugar out of foods? Well, it will always depend on the food, but commonly what you do observe is a reduction in the taste intensity, so sweetness and saltiness goes down. That's not the only impact it has. You also see a decline in the overall flavor of the product, which is often linked to the preference. So preference might go down. You see next to these changes in the sensory properties also changes can occur with respect to the functional properties that salt and sugar has in foods. So structuring processes might change, the resulting final structure in the food might change, which leads to changes in texture that might be perceivable. So problems in the manufacturing process might occur, also linked to unacceptable mouthfeel eventually in the product. So these are all the issues that need to be tackled. If you talk about salt reduction, if you go for dramatic reductions in salt, well, then you have to also consider the shelf life that might be shortened. So talking about the preservative functionality of salt in food. Having said that, what are the common strategies to tackle those challenges? The first one I put on this slide is replacing sugar by sweeteners. So those are low-calorie, high-intensity sweetening agents. And for salt replacement, commonly used are mixes of inorganic salts that contain, for instance, potassium salts and other inorganic salts in order to cut down on the sodium. A second approach that can be followed is a stepwise gradual reduction over time. So that means in a product, a company decides to take out a little bit of a taste over longer time periods, and the changes they take out are so small that they're not perceived by the consumer as a change. That has been shown to be a very powerful and a very cost-efficient means to cut down on salt and sugar levels. chemicals. In the UK, that approach was followed, for instance, to lower salt content in a variety of foods following this health by stealth approach. It works in particular well if an entire brand organization follows this approach so that the consumer does not notice the difference of one product relative to a competitor's product. When I say small reduction steps need to be made, so what is small, that is something one can also look into. Of course, that will depend on the product. We've done a study looking into muffins, and in muffins, what you can see here is actually taking 10% sugar and at the same time 40% fat out of a reformulation is possible without a naive consumer detecting a difference. So that raises the question, how small is small? That is one approach to go. A third one is the addition of taste boosters. So those are ingredients that might not have a taste themselves, but have the capability of enhancing saltiness or sweetness perception in a food, or the addition of odors, so modifying the aroma profile of foods, and that's something that the following speaker, Thierry Thomas Dagar, will talk about in detail, how that can be used to cut down salt levels in foods. So what's left for me to talk about is the last point, that is to what extent can we actually use the structure of the food and modify the texture in order to enhance taste perception in foods. So the triangle that I will walk you through today is very much the one spanned by the food structure. So this is the properties of the food, the physical, chemical properties, all things that food engineers can modify, and we are interested in how that links to the behavior of the food in the mouth. So this is what I refer to as the bolus formation. So those are structural changes of the food as they occur in the mouth. And on the other side, I will be talking about the behavior of the person chewing a food. We've seen this morning in the first lecture that, for instance, video recordings in mice can be used to get information about the oral processing behavior in animals. Well, you can do the same thing, and I show you some techniques that we are using there to do that in humans in order to get information how they actually eat, and how that influences ultimately the dynamic perception of sensory, which is the third box. So what I'll try to span are all these three boxes, and I put emphasis on the arrows, so the connections between structure, oral processing, and sensory perception. I'll start talking about microscopic modifications in the food structure and how they influence perception of texture and taste. This is an overview that I don't want to go into great detail. I just want to motivate the choice of model foods and the need to study model foods to get a basic understanding of what is actually happening in the mouth when we eat foods. So those model systems are typically gels that consist of protein and polysaccharides, which now allows us to modify the molecular weight, the charge density, the pH, or the conformation of the protein or the polysaccharide. And if we start to mix them, either attraction forces might occur or repulsion, which means in time, ultimately phase separation will occur. If I now start in competition to the time-dependent phase separation to gel the food matrix, I can realize all sorts of microstructures in the food. I can make bicontinuous gels. If I, next to the gelation process, start applying shear, I can make elongated, stretched, anisotropic structures. The same holds if I go on the attraction aggregation pathway shown here. I can end up with gelled microspheres embedded in a matrix, which can also be elongated by the application of shear. To give you some examples of what that looks like, these are pictures from a confocal scanning laser microscope. What you see in orange is the protein phase. What you see in black is the polysaccharide-rich phase. And now, depending on the type of polysaccharide or other physical chemical parameters, we can realize a variety of structures. In the absence of polysaccharide, we have a homogeneous structure, so it's orange everywhere. If you now start adding polysaccharides to it, we can realize smaller aggregates in a coarse-stranded network. We can have a structure that is continuous in the protein phase. So in orange is the protein phase, and you see spherical pores that are rich in polysaccharide phase. If we increase the polysaccharide concentration further, we enter a bicontinuous system that is continuous now both in polysaccharide phase as well as protein phase. And eventually we reach heterogeneous structures that eventually also phase separate macroscopically. So I'd like to take a step back now. If you now keep in mind those microstructures, why are we interested in studying them, and what does that have to do with salt and sugar reduction? So I'd like to invite you to participate in a thought experiment with me. Imagine you have a glass of cherry juice in front of you. That is 200 milliliters commercial normal cherry juice. If I would ask you for descriptors to describe the sensory properties of the food, probably most of you will come up with sweetness, thickness, cherry flavor, intensity. Sweetness is the one that I'm after. That's not surprising. Cherry juice contains around 10 to 15% sugar, so it's considered sweet. In general terms, it's liked. Now you take this glass of cherry juice that contains 200 milliliters juice, and you add 19 sugar cubes to that. So what do you think will happen to the sweetness perception and the liking of such a product? Well, sweetness perception will go up dramatically. That is not a surprise. We increased the sugar content to 50% and liking will go down. I really recommend to do this at home. It is disgustingly sweet. Well, why do I emphasize that? If we now start adding 14 grams of gelatin to it, heat it, cool it, we realized a cherry-flavored gummy bear which still has 50% sugar and 7% gelatin, and now the sweetness and the liking are okay. So what have we learned from this? 50% sugar in a liquid matrix is unacceptable sweet, whereas 50% sugar in a semi-solid gelled matrix is acceptable. Why is that the case? One of the reasons there is that the sugar is not released during oral processing of the gummy bear. That means the majority of the sugar contributes to the calorie intake at the end of the day, but it does not give rise directly to a sensory perception of sweetness. So the question is, how can we liberate more of the sugar from the food matrix so that it more efficiently triggers a sensory response? Well, this brings us back to our microstructures. If we now look into these gels there, you see here in blue a gel that releases around less than 5% serum when it's being squeezed. So the experiment we do is we take a gel, we squeeze it, and we just measure the amount of water that contains the sugar as being squeezed out. If you now modify the structure and go to a coarse-stranded network, those are the gels shown here in brown and green. We see we can realize 20 to 10% of serum being squeezed out. If we realize a bicontinuous structure, that's the one shown in red here, we can go up to 50% of the serum being squeezed out upon mechanical compression. So we have a delivery system that very effectively delivers the taste that you do want to deliver. And the way we achieve that is by changing the porosity of the food matrix. So what does that look like in terms of perception? What I show you here is just for 3 samples, the perceived sweetness as a function of sugar concentration. So obviously if you increase fructose, sweetness goes up. But at any given fructose concentration, the gel that releases very little serum is the least sweet, whereas a gel shown in green here that releases most of the serum, that has a bicontinuous network structure, is by far perceived the most sweet at a given sugar concentration. So it is a means to enhance sweetness perception by a structural modification of the food matrix. This is talking about gels, the question is, does that also work in real foods? And yes, it does. So we've been making cooked sausages as shown here, and also by structural modifications there, by adding polysaccharides, we are able to change the amount of serum that is being squeezed out. Those are very small amounts, 1, 2, 3% is already enough. in order to change the perceived juiciness of the food. And if we change the juiciness of the food, at the same time we change the saltiness. So here you see at 3 salt levels. Let's just look at the green one, the lowest salt level in the sausage. We have a low saltiness score when the perceived juiciness is low. As soon as we start changing the structure of the system and we increase the juiciness, at the same time the perceived saltiness is increasing. And that works very well at various levels of salt in the food. So it is applicable to real foods such as cooked sausages in this case. I want to move on in my triangle now to the 2 bottom corners, so the link between the oral processing behavior of foods to sensory perception. I will be talking about the properties of the food in the mouth, but also about the behavior, how people eat, and how that is linked to texture and taste perception. This is a conceptual model of texture that probably some of you are familiar with. I just want to emphasize there are 3 axes. One is time, so that is the mastication time. And while we masticate food, the degree of the structure is being reduced through the mastication process, and at the same time saliva is being added and incorporated into the bolus, so the degree of lubrication increases in time. And if the structure breakdown is sufficient and the lubrication is sufficient, that's the moment when we decide it's safe to swallow a food. And you see different breakdown pathways of different foods. So if you take a tough, dry piece of meat, that is this line here, you need a lot of reduction in the structure of the food. You need quite some lubrication before you swallow it, which is very different, for instance, from a sponge cake, so a much softer material. If it's dry, you need little reduction in the structure, but you need quite an amount of lubrication to be added in time before a person decides it's safe to swallow. So if we talk about bolus, what does it look like? These are just a few pictures. If somebody eats a gel and spits it out after different time moments, then you get masses that look like this. You can separate those particles, then you get pictures like this, which you can subject to image analyzers. And what you then basically get out, for instance, is the number of fragments that are formed as a function of chewing time and the size of them as a function of chews. What I want to emphasize here is that the fracture strain, so the deformation at which a material breaks, is really one of the determinant factors that influence the chew down behavior of those foods. So what we see is a gel here in the bottom that breaks down in a small number of pieces. Those pieces are obviously very large, whereas here we have a gel that breaks down in a lot of pieces with chewing, and those pieces are very small, and the mechanical parameter describing this is the fracture strain. Why do I show that? Well, it's not surprising that the surface area that is generated upon the breakdown of the food in the mouth determines the release of the tastings to the food. The more new surface area is generated, the more tastings can migrate from the matrix to the taste bud and trigger a sensory response. And that is basically shown here. If you look at an individual surface area of an individual fragment, that means we have here fragments that are very small, which means we have a lot of them, which means the total surface area is very large. Those are perceived as very sweet, whereas the system, if you now reduce the size, if we increase the size of the surface area of an individual fragment, that means we reduce at the same time the number of particles, which means we reduce the total surface area. It means that the perceived sweetness also goes down. So we can manipulate the breakdown behavior, which impacts the taste perception of a food. Here in Dijon, a method has been developed by Pascal Schlich over the last 10-15 years called temporal dominance of sensation. That's a beautiful sensory tool that allows us to study the dynamics of perception, for instance, of texture perception. What you typically get are temporal profiles like this. So you see here on the axis the food intake, and at 100% of the normalized time, you see the moment of swallow, and this is now a food that is being perceived as a dominant sensation in an early stage as firm. then it's perceived as sticky, then melting plays a role, and towards the end it's being perceived as creamy. So we see that those textural attributes change over time. And in generally speaking, what we do see is that the attributes that occur in the beginning of the mastication cycle are very well understood, whereas the attributes that tend to occur to be dominant at the end of the mastication cycle, those are the ones that are less well understood. I want to give you now a couple of examples how that actually can be used. So what you see here is two sensory profiles of the same product. It's an Ardenner sausage, commercial sausage, that's being perceived by two groups of people in the beginning very similar. First it's hard, then it's grainy. That's the same in the graph down there. But towards the end we see very different perceptions. One group perceives the sausage as fatty, the other as juicy. So that means what we all know is perception can vary between people. The same product can vary between people in terms of perception. So the question is now, can we explain these differences in perception between people based on the way they eat, based on their chewing behavior? So in our case, these two groups of people were people that eat the sausage very fast or very slow. So this is their natural eating behavior. The question that we now raised was actually, are the eaters that eat the product fast, do they chew more efficiently? So do they compensate for a shorter chewing time by chewing with a higher force or by chewing at a higher frequency? And that's not the case. They apply the same force, they apply the same chewing frequency, they just chew for a shorter time. So therefore, it's also not surprising to see that at the end of mastication, basically, the bolus they swallow is very different. The fast eaters are comfortable swallowing very large pieces, whilst the slow eaters are comfortable swallowing very small pieces. Looking into the properties of those bolus towards the end, we see a clear discrimination in the amount of saliva that has been incorporated in the bolus at the time point where it's being swallowed, where we see that the slow eaters have a higher amount of saliva being incorporated. The same holds actually for the amount of fat that's being released. I do not show this data, but that basically means now we can explain the differences in perception between the people, whether it's juicy or fatty towards the end, based on the behavior, how the people chew the food, and this behavior influences the sensory perception ultimately, which now means it puts us into a position where we can really come up with a new model that links the dynamic perception, the occurrence of certain attributes over time, to certain physical properties of the bolus of all the food, and we can link them to the behavior of the person. So I think this is in general terms where currently this field is heading to. I want to wrap up the last part very quickly. This is about taste contrast. Thierry will be also talking a bit about this to the end. We all know that the perception of an object depends on the context in which it's being presented. This is for the sense of vision. If you look into the intensity of the inner square, then it appears that this square is darker. Well, it actually is not. The only difference is that it's presented in a different context, in a different contrast. That is something one can use in food for taste perception as well. So we've been baking breads where we are mixing two doughs, where one dough contains little salt, the other dough contains a lot of salts, or we use encapsulates to make these hot spots with a high intensity of salt. And what we then see is basically that a food that has, this is what it looks like in the lab. You can make these layers there. If you add a dye. And what you then see, if you take the salt out of the bread, saltiness goes down. But at any salt level, if you now start adding, making bread with a contrast, that the perceived saltiness goes up. Those can be dramatic effects. At 1% salt, you can double perceived saltiness. using this technology. So that is attractive, certainly in combination with other means of reducing salt in bread. With this, I would like to come to my conclusion. Well, I hope I was able to show you that salt and sugar reduction foods are possible by changing the structure of the food. For example, if you start thinking about increasing the amount of tastings that is actually released from the matrix. I've given you an example how we can modify the breakdown properties of foods in order to enhance taste perception. I've given you an example how we can use the oral processing behavior of people to understand the links between the properties of the food and perception, and also to understand differences in perception between people caused by differences in behavior, how they eat. And on the bread example, that was an example how the spatial modulation of the distribution of food components is a strategy to reduce sugar, salt, and fat. I only showed salt, but it works for sugar and fat as good. That's the last remark. I think those reduction strategies are not universal, so they depend always on the food that you're talking about. And of course, they can or should be combined to reach significant reductions. With this, I would like to thank you and my collaborators. And I'm open for questions.
Thank you very much. We have just time for one short question. I'm sorry, but I have to take the time. So, there, any question? So, I've got one. You showed us some water in water emulsion with you showed us some water in water emulsions by when you played on when you had some polysaccharides with proteins. You have a structure with phase separation and then a structure of water in water emulsion. And then when you give it to the people, it seems that the sweetness is higher. Do you study the mechanism you have which is behind that?
Okay. So the system I was presenting, those were gel systems. So they are not liquid water and water emulsions. Those are heat set or cold set whey protein gels to which we add the polysaccharides. So next to the phase separation, we have a gelation process. So in the end, we end up with a self-supporting semi-solid gel. What we did look into is really the amount of sugar that's being squeezed out upon mechanical compression. And indeed, if you change the microstructure, if they become bicontinuous, if you increase the porosity, also the amount of sugar being released physically increases, which we think is one of the factors explaining the observed increase in sweetness perception.
Okay. Thank you very much.